Hey, just gonna lag for a moment and wait for the stream to connect. Looking forward to all of your questions and comments today. Be starting in just a moment. All right, how's everybody doing today? Hope this finds you doing well. Hope you're taking good care of yourself. And yeah, let's get into it. Welcome back. I'm Jim LaPierre. This is Sober Now. Today we're doing a Q&A format. Would love to hear your questions. What's going on with your recovery? What kind of resources are you looking for? How can we be helpful to you today? I've got a number of questions messaged in today, and thank you to everybody that wrote in. Interestingly, all of today's questions and topics center around relationships and concerns about codependency. So I'm going to jump right into that. But before I do, if you haven't already been over to Sober Now's Facebook page, please head over there and give it a quick like so that you can get notified about future live streams and other content that we're creating. Would love to have you on board. And so I guess my starting point will be that the term codependency has been overused to the point that really when we're referring to anything that's unhealthy in a relationship, it's either toxic, codependent, or dysfunctional. Those are really the terms that we most often use. I think what codependency was originally designed to describe is being excessively emotionally or psychologically dependent on other people. So, in other words, I don't feel okay unless you're okay, and I need you to help me feel okay. Relating to others in a codependent fashion is really about a handful of things. For most of us, it's an attempt to earn love and acceptance because we come from a place of feeling unworthy. For others of us, it is simply avoidance of self. We tend to associate codependency primarily with romantic relationships, but in truth, it happens in every kind of relationship. Um, at the same time, we don't conceptualize how we relate to ourselves as constituting a relationship, but it very much is. Being my own worst enemy was a relationship. Being somebody who ignored and really was highly critical of me was a way of relating to myself. So my starting points in terms of how it is that we relate to ourselves are not touchy-feely. I emphasize the importance of self-respect and fairness. And if we can do those things, we're going to get a lot of mileage out of it. Too often, the conversations that we have around codependency focus on self-worth and self-esteem. And there's a lot to unpack there. But trying to feel better about yourself before you do better is exactly backwards. We have to do better in order to feel better. Of course, codependency intersects hugely with being a trauma survivor. It overlaps with experiences in substance use disorder, mental illness, and a host of other conditions. But I like to keep things simple. Most of what we learned about how to relate to ourselves and others, the foundation for that was built in our family of origin. And unfortunately for people like me, what we learned primarily was what not to do. Our ideas about what it is that we deserve and what we're worthy of typically are formed in our family of origin. And codependency, when it's learned in a family affected by substance use disorder, is best understood through the characteristics and traits of being an adult child of an alcoholic. So there's a lot of intersections here, but codependency and being an ACOA tend to go hand in hand. And what I share with folks is that the dynamics, the roles and characteristics that we learn in an addicted family also occur when addiction is not present, but different forms of trauma, abuse, and neglect are. So everything that we learned is compensating for the unhealthiness and dysfunction of the family unit that we grew up in. There's a million good books and resources about codependency. I tend to favor the concepts espoused by Codependents Anonymous. And what I appreciate about them is that they break down different patterns that we find ourselves in. So if we're able to take a step back and really examine ourselves and our lives, quite often we can notice patterns that we tend to go into with relationships especially. The CODA program breaks it down into four patterns: denial, control, compliance, and avoidance. So I'm going to run down through some of the common characteristics that we tend to see, and again, very much invite your comments, your questions. Abby, thanks for joining us today. Let's see, denial patterns. Codependents often have difficulty identifying what we're feeling. We minimize, alter, or deny our true feelings, and we often perceive ourselves as being completely unselfish and dedicated to the well-being of others. And that may well be true, but while we're excessively loyal and dedicated to others, we are often disloyal to ourselves. We're the people who throw ourselves under the bus the most. Self-esteem patterns. Codependents often have difficulty making decisions, and not just major life decisions, but even as simple as where do you want to go to lunch. We're afraid to have preferences, strong opinions. We're afraid to disagree with others. We often judge what we think, say, or do harshly. I often will say to folks that whatever's happening for you internally ought not to be judged. So feelings, thoughts, and memories are naturally occurring, and judging them is very self-limiting and potentially self-destructive. Outward actions, statements, things that we're doing, maybe those can be subject to judgment, but my experience is that we are often unfair in our judgment of self. Codependents are often embarrassed to receive recognition, praise, affirmation. We're people who kill ourselves to earn the compliment and then are too uncomfortable to receive it. So we tend to deflect or use humor to laugh it away. And we forget that the person who's honoring us is giving us a gift. And we lose sight of the fact that not receiving that gift isn't just about us, it affects them. Codependents are unable to identify or ask for what we need and want. And there's a lot to that, but the most important piece is we have to know ourselves well enough and have an awareness of what we need and want in order to ask for it. Then, of course, we have to embrace the vulnerability of actually doing that. We value others' approval of our thinking, feeling, and behavior over our own approval. Which is a setup, to be sure. We tend to not perceive ourselves as being lovable or worthy. Next patterns are compliance. So codependents often compromise their values and integrity to avoid rejection and other people's anger. So we are people who are very fearful of conflict. We will go along to get along. We will readily sacrifice and not be true to ourselves, not speak up. We are very sensitive to others' feelings, and we tend to take on their feelings. A lot of us refer to ourselves as empaths, and I like that concept, but the trouble with being an empath is we have these sponge-like hearts where we absorb other people's fears, other people's pain, other people's problems, and then we act as if they're our own. We are excessively loyal. We tend to remain in harmful situations and abusive relationships. We place a higher value on others' opinions and feelings, and we're afraid to express our own. We oftentimes put aside our own interests in order to make other people a priority, and oftentimes, sadly, we accept sex as a substitute for love. Control patterns. As codependents, we often believe that people are incapable of taking care of themselves, and so this is the rationalizing of why we need to do for them. when we say that others are incapable, we absolve them of responsibility. When we deny ourselves the right to feel hurt and angered by others, we often will say, well, they're doing the best they can. And in this way, we absolve them of responsibility, but we also deny our true feelings and the right to express them. We often attempt to convince others what to think, do, or feel. This is the emotional manipulation that tends to be part and parcel to codependent relationships. We become resentful when others decline our help or reject our advice. We freely offer advice and direction without being asked. We tend to lavish gifts and favors on those that we want approval from or those that we hope to influence. This is often a rejection of powerlessness. We use sex to gain approval and acceptance, and we often have to feel needed in order to be in a relationship with others. For so many of us, it's really difficult to believe that we can be loved unless we are needed. The idea that we would be wanted or that someone would just enjoy having us in their lives is something that's hard for us to wrap our heads and hearts around. And finally, avoidance patterns. Codependents often act in ways that invite others to reject us, shame us, or express anger towards us. We judge harshly what others think, say, or do. We avoid emotional, physical, and sexual intimacy to avoid feeling vulnerable. We allow addictions to people, places, and things to distract us from ourselves and from achieving intimacy in relationships. We use indirect or evasive communication to avoid conflict or confrontation. And finally, we believe displays of emotion are something to be avoided. Sometimes we view them as weakness. Other times, what we're really doing is avoiding being vulnerable and embracing a stoic way of being. And of course, all of these are incredibly incredibly self-limiting. I'm going to share with you a quick quiz, if you will. Questions that we commonly ask to help a person determine are they codependent? Are they behaving codependently in their relationships? A lot of these are connected to trauma and specifically connected to the experience of being an adult child of an alcoholic or addict. So I'll rattle them off and then we can explore them a little bit. The first question, do you have an intense fear of abandonment? Because this is very common amongst us. Not only do we have a fear of abandonment, we have an expectation of abandonment. And we have, at the same time, a very strong desire for reassurance, but we're afraid to ask for it. So oftentimes what we do is push people away just to see if they come back. And then, of course, there comes a point at which we push too much, and so then they leave. And then we've come to the fruition of our self-fulfilling prophecy. We believe that people are going to leave us sooner or later, and so we push them away because we want reassurance that they're not leaving. But if we continue to push, then what we've created is a really unhealthy dynamic in a relationship. Second question, do you feel responsible for the actions of others? Yes, we are excessively responsible people. We take ownership of things that absolutely do not belong to us. We take on other people's problems, and we have this enduring belief that if no one else is going to take care of something, then that means that I have to. Next question, do you often make sacrifices to keep your partner happy? Not compromises, not trade-offs, but just continuously sacrificing to avoid conflict, continuously sacrificing because we were taught that that's what love is. My experience is that sacrifice most often becomes resentment. Next question, do you ever overvalue the approval of others? And here again is the double bind where we kill ourselves to earn approval and then deny ourselves the right to accept it. Even if we do experience that others approve of us, we don't view that as an enduring thing. So we set out to earn love and acceptance every day, and we start anew each time. Are you, really hard question, are you unable to stay single? I've worked with a number of folks recently who just find themselves going from one romantic partnership to another with very little or even no time in between. A lot of us are afraid to simply be alone with ourselves. We're uncomfortable spending time alone because what happens when, especially when we rest, is that we naturally become more aware of ourselves, which is the very thing that most of us are trying to avoid. This is a problematic question, but it should be asked. Are you financially reliant on your partner? And the reason that that's important is because financial abuse is something that we tend not to talk enough about. It's if this is something that your partner holds over you or uses against you, then I would be very concerned for you, and I would encourage you to look at what resources you can be utilizing and become more autonomous. Next question. Do you have difficulty expressing your needs? Yes. Typically, to express what it is that I need requires vulnerability, requires open and direct communication, and again, more foundationally, it requires that I have an awareness of my own need. We are very external people. We tend to be very aware of the needs, wants, and feelings of others, but we don't have a corresponding awareness of ourselves. Next question. Do you feel no one else will love you? Too often we stay in unhealthy relationships because they're familiar, they're known. What I've often heard from folks is the devil you know is better than the devil you don't, which of course assumes that all relationships for you are going to be less than satisfying, less than fulfilling. The idea that you are unlovable, the idea that you are not worthy of a healthy partner is sadly a very common false belief, but I promise that that is not true of you at all. A couple more questions. Do you have difficulty making decisions? Yes, yes, we do. And this is a place where we tend to judge ourselves harshly. We don't judge other people by their past, but we sure do judge ourselves. And the more resentment that we hold against ourselves, the more likely we are to struggle in making the next decision. And the final question, do you trust yourself? And wow, that cuts right to the quick. I think arguably the most important part about having a manageable life is being on the same page with yourself, having a strong self-awareness. And when we don't trust ourselves, sure, we have a long history of lying to ourselves. And a lot of those lies were the minimizing, rationalizing, and justifying that addiction instilled. A lot of those lies were white lies. They were denial of self, saying things to ourselves like, I'm not angry about that. I don't feel hurt by that. It's okay. So I'm going to check the streams real quick because I love getting your questions and comments. And then we're going to talk about some aspects of having a healthier relationship and what that looks like. Okay, Marie, good to have you with us today. Yes, the difficulty even in picking a restaurant is uncomfortable. We're afraid, what if I make the wrong choice? What if people are upset with me? It's scary to have a preference. But in the absence of that, it's a little too passive, and the simple truth is that passive approaches don't work for us. It's okay to have an opinion. It's okay to simply say, "Here's what I want," and if it doesn't work out, then let's talk about it. Let's compromise. Let's clear this up. I want to actually touch on some misconceptions that are very common about healthy partnerships. And it's funny because I can talk about a healthy partnership for hours on end. But I always quote my wife, the accountant. My wife says that relationships are work, and you either do the work in an ongoing fashion or you get to have a less than satisfying relationship. And I couldn't agree more. We've been very happily married 34 years, and the in the enduring misconception that there is happily ever after suggests that we reach a point where there's never any conflict and there's never any disagreement and we don't ever get on each other's nerves, which is just not reality. To continuously work on the relationship is to be dedicated to it, because we're not stagnant people. The idea that we might grow apart is based in the idea that we're both growing, but we're not sharing a life together. And so putting in that effort and asking for, again, the simplest things. Here's what I want, here's what I need, here's what I'm feeling. I'm convinced that if we could all do that, most of the conflict and misunderstandings that we have would go away immediately. I'm going to share with you a few themes. A good friend of mine who's an excellent couples counselor shared these with me very recently. 5 misconceptions about healthy partnerships. The first one is that in a healthy relationship there's little or no conflict. That simply isn't true. Because of our history, because of our upbringing, we tend to associate conflict with confrontation. And so we have this idea that a disagreement is likely to escalate, likely to become something that's hurtful or even abusive. But to use the restaurant analogy, if I feel like getting Thai food tonight and she'd rather get Italian, that's conflict. And how we resolve that, work through that, can be done in healthy ways or unhealthy ways. But the idea that there shouldn't be conflict is a really unhealthy belief. Next one. I am not complete without an intimate partner relationship. Good Lord, I hate that idea, but it is very common. I go back to all of the romantic comedies that I've ever seen that suggest not only are you incomplete until you find the right partner, but that your life is inherently lacking, and this simply is not true. I'm showing my age by quoting this, but I often share with young women Gloria Steinem's quote that a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle, meaning that it's fine if you want one, but you certainly don't need a man or any partner to complete yourself, complete your life. Major misconception that we should always touch on: intimate partner violence won't happen to me. Roughly 25% of cisgendered women and 14% of cisgendered men in the United States will be victims of physical violence by a partner or a spouse at some point in their lifetimes. This, of course, is heartbreaking. It's intolerable, but the idea that it can't happen to me is simply a myth. One final misconception: in a serious dating relationship, nothing should be hidden. It is often said that there should be no secrets. That may or may not be true, but I think the distinction that's really important here is that you always have a right to your privacy. So if you choose not to share something, are you keeping a secret? I would say no. I would say one of the things that we it's so common that we joke about it in recovery is the classic joke: what is it that 2 people in the program need on their 3rd date? And the answer is a U-Haul. We're people who tend to rush into relationships. We are seeking something, wanting to experiencing something that usually we've never had, and we have this insatiable, not only desire for it, but this sense of urgency for it. The more that folks have not experienced healthy relationships, and the more that their life feels incomplete, the fear of dying alone, the fear of never finding that perfect love tends to overshadow absolutely everything else. What's really unfortunate is that because of our histories, because of our shame and our guilt, we tend to test people, but we also tend to disclose a lot about ourselves. So the dynamic that I often see is you've been on a handful of dates, maybe 3 or 4, and then you feel this need to sit your dating partner down and say, listen, before we go any further, I'm going to tell you all the reasons why you should run. And we use this really unhealthy form of self-disclosure prematurely. And Unfortunately, what we're really doing is sharing with them our shame, our guilt, our trauma histories, the terrible things that we did while we were in active addiction. And uh, first of all, this is premature. No one has the right to know those things about you. And to share those things on like the third date is oftentimes sharing way too much about yourself before the relationship has really grown or developed. And so the cycle that we sometimes find ourselves in is giving people every reason to leave because we're afraid that they will. And then what's lost in that perspective is whether or not we even want this, whether or not we're willing to commit to it. And so we give them every possible reason to run. Thanks to folks who are writing in. Let's say, Marie, you stated that we stopped developing due to abuse. This is true. What I was referring to is arrested development, and this is a concept that we tend to tie to addiction recovery. The age at which we started using drugs or alcohol is typically the age at which we stop developing emotionally. But it is also the case that when we experience trauma, that too arrests development. And so an awful lot of us are running around feeling like scared little kids in overgrown bodies. We're pretending that we know what we're doing. And that kind of dovetails nicely into the next question that posed. How do we begin to catch up to our chronological age was essentially the question. Recovery in any form is very much a process of growing up and making investments in our healing, but also learning everything from basic life skills to how to have healthy relationships to what are the things that I most want in life. And the learning curve here is tremendous. The expression that my friends in AA use is we found the only thing we needed to change was everything. That's a lot, but what it's really about is growing up and becoming the person that I and my higher power most want me to be. Codependency dictates that I should be the person that you want me to be because then you will love me, accept me, approve of me, which is really a horrible proposition because even when I've pulled it off, when I've behaved and done as you wanted me to, even when I act as the person that you want me to be, I don't really gain acceptance or love. I gain this person that I pretend to be as somebody that you like. More questions. Thank you so much. We are more than our past. That is exactly true. Do you think this is because we weren't really available? Our emotional availability is certainly arrested by substance use disorder, by self-harm, by eating disorders, by a number of different things that distract us from ourselves. Unfortunately, we tend to seek out people who are emotionally unavailable because those are the types of people that we're most familiar with. We tend to seek out people who are struggling because one of the most honorable ways to avoid yourself is by having others depend on you. And that too feels like love because it feels like being needed. Let's see. I want to touch on a couple of key points and then we're going to be winding down. Again, my starting points for folks are to begin with fairness and self-respect. I don't want to focus on self-esteem because that's trying to feel better before we do better. I preach mindfulness, which is really a nice term for, hey, I need you to pay attention to yourself so that you can notice the unhealthy things you do, because most of those are subconsciously driven. They're emotional reactions. They happen instantaneously. They're not things that we're doing as conscious decisions. So mindfulness allows me to notice the things that I do automatically and allows me to notice the reactions that I have, and then it allows me to choose to respond instead of reacting. It can be as simple as 2 deep breaths and a conscious choice about what happens next. Notice the places that you get stuck. Um, I often quote the perks of being a wallflower. The quote is, "In the end, we receive the love we believe we deserve." So many of us get stuck in guilt and shame that don't even belong to us. So many of us feel like the dented can on the shelf, that because we feel broken, because we have survived so much of the hell that we went through in our childhoods and so much that we went through in addiction, that we are inherently broken or that we are not lovable. And I promise you that that absolutely is not true. Learning to set boundaries, learning to be vulnerable are two of the biggest learning curves in terms of moving away from codependency and having healthy relationships. Vulnerability is tough because we learned as children that being open and honest and expressive is a way to get hurt. Trusting your intuition about who you can be open with and who is safe to be expressive with is huge. Setting boundaries is hard. We question whether or not we have a right to that, but and we agonize way too much about finding just the right time or just the right words to convey a boundary that we want to set. And whenever we're doing that, what we're really doing is procrastinating and hoping to get to a place where we feel comfortable doing this. And it simply doesn't work that way. In order to have growth and healing, I have to have a willingness to be uncomfortable. I have to have a willingness to muddle through and do some things that feel really awkward. But boundaries can be as simple as saying, this is what I am willing to do, this is what I am not. This is what I'm willing to accept, this is what I'm not willing to accept. Ideally, as we grow, as we continue our journey in recovery, in any form, not just from substance use disorder, but from trauma, from all of the things that we've gone through, we're going to gain some emotional maturity. We're going to be rigorously honest with ourselves. We're going to have people who hold us accountable and challenge us. We're going to seek to have a really wide support system and have folks. I often hear from people, I want to keep my circle small. And I do see value in that as a principle, but I also see it used as a way to justify not allowing people into your life or not allowing them to get too close. So I just hope that we can be more open and expressive with each other. Things are hard in the world, and between the pandemic and everything else that we've been through recently, with all the socio-political unrest that's happening in the world, it just is obvious to me that we need each other more than we ever have. That's why I'm here, hoping to share with you all what I've learned over the years of my work and my recovery. And that's also why we're committed to making more resources available completely free of charge. So two quick resources. The first one is Sober Now's YouTube channel. Dozens and dozens and dozens of videos there on different aspects of recovery, completely free. And our big news that we've been sharing recently is Sober Now's 28-day recovery programs. We have two. We have one for enhancing your recovery from substance use disorder, and we have a second program for people like me who identify as affected others. Both of those are on our site, sobernow.com. They are completely free. You can access them with 100% anonymity, with 100% confidentiality. You can go at your own pace. In each of the 28-day programs, there is a video short lecture and a bunch of suggestions and homework assignments that you can work through and maybe learn a little bit more about yourself and what it is that you need and how to get those needs met. Marie, I so appreciate you. Abby, it's great to have you with us today, and thank you to everybody that wrote in. I always crave connection, and if I can be helpful to you, please reach out to me. Jim at sobernow.com is the quickest and easiest way to do that. Would love to hear questions that you have. Would really love to hear topics that you'd like to see covered in future live streams, questions that you'd like answered. We're changing up the format a little bit here and there to just try to meet the need, but most importantly, please take care of yourselves, please reach out to each other, and please let us know how we can be helpful to you. Blessed be, and I'll look forward to